Imagine the autumn of 1845. The air is already thick with the sweet, sickening smell of rotting vegetation. Columns of emaciated people, looking more like walking skeletons, stand silently by the dirt roads. They are watching heavy wooden wagons roll past. These wagons are overflowing with prime grain, golden and dry, followed closely by herds of well-fed cattle. The convoy is heading straight for the ports. British soldiers march alongside the cargo, their bayonets fixed and gleaming in the damp Irish weather. Their orders are strictly to maintain order and keep the routes clear. During the absolute worst years of what history calls the Great Potato Famine, dozens of ships left Irish docks every single day. Their holds were packed to the brim with beef, butter and wheat. Ireland was never a barren wasteland. The soil was incredibly fertile, producing a massive commercial agricultural surplus.
The resulting death toll was driven by strict adherence to free market policies and export quotas. The sheer scale of the extraction defies everything we intuitively associate with starvation. Famines are traditionally linked to drought, scorched earth, or total ecological collapse. You expect to see a landscape where nothing grows. But the Irish reality in the mid-1840s defied basic logic. The rural countryside was green and lush. Only one specific plant was rotting in the ground, while everything else thrived. The wheat grew tall, the cows were fattened, and the dairy operations operated at peak capacity. The land was yielding exactly the volumes of commercial produce recorded in the ledgers. In 1845 alone, over 25 million bushels of grain were exported across the Irish Sea. This happened exactly as the mysterious Blight first turned the potato fields into black, putrid sludge. Even as the death toll climbed among the rural poor, the volume of these shipments continued to increase. Let us look at the year 1847, forever scarred into the national memory as Black 47. Roughly 400,000 people died in that single 12-month span from starvation and typhus. Yet, during those exact same months, approximately 4,000 ships carrying high-quality food departed from Ireland. They sailed out of busy ports in Dublin, Waterford, and Cork, bound for the markets of Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool, and London. The structure of Irish agriculture was ruthlessly stratified. Before the crisis, about 3/4 of all arable land on the island was dedicated to commercial agriculture. Nearly 2.5 million acres were sown with oats. Another 1 million acres grew wheat and barley. These were universally known as the money crops. They were considered a raw financial instrument destined entirely for the British market.
Their sale allowed the tenant farmers to pay their exorbitant rents to absentee landlords. The geography of this division was stark. The fertile valleys and prime agricultural lands were exclusively reserved for these export commodities. The native Irish population was pushed to the margins, forced to cultivate the rocky hillsides and boggy patches. That is why the potato became their lifeline. It was the only crop rugged enough to grow in the poorest soil, providing just enough calories to keep a family alive, while they worked the landlord's prime estates. The historian Cecil Woodham Smith noted a bitter truth about this dynamic. She wrote that nothing provoked more lingering anger or so deeply embittered relations between England and Ireland quite like this undisputed reality. Huge quantities of food were shipped out while the people who planted and harvested it dropped dead in the mud. The mass starvation was completely disconnected from the actual food supply on the island. The true cause was a total collapse in purchasing power. The legal architecture of the British Empire dictated that a starving farmer could not eat the oats he had just harvested. That oat legally belonged to the landlord. Consuming or withholding the harvest was legally considered theft or rebellion, which the state suppressed with military force. Imagine standing near the docks of Waterford during this period. You would see desperate families attempting to block the roads, trying to halt the carts filled with grain. Local historical records detail how these crowds were violently dispersed by armed police and military escorts. British regiments and dragoon guards were deployed across the countryside. Their explicit orders were to protect the warehouses and ensure the unimpeded export of commercial goods. The ledgers of this extraction are chilling to read. In just the first 9 months of 1847, over 91,000 firkins of butter arrived in Bristol and Liverpool from Ireland.
That is the equivalent of roughly 822,000 gallons of butter. It was exported during the deadliest phase of mass mortality. Monthly food exports during the famine were valued at around £100,000 sterling. The livestock trade reveals an even more macabre calculation. Between 1846 and 1850, more than 3 million live animals were shipped to Britain. To put that in perspective, more animals were exported for slaughter than the total number of people who managed to flee the island. John Mitchell, a political writer and prominent nationalist of the time, captured the surreal arithmetic of the crisis. He calculated that Ireland actually produced enough food, wool, and flax to sustain 18 million people. That was more than double its population. Yet, he observed a devastating routine at the docks. A ship entering an Irish port with a meager cargo of relief grain would inevitably meet 6 ships sailing out with commercial harvests.
Mitchell later formulated the phrase that would define the era. The Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. Mitchell's observations reflected a widespread disbelief among contemporary observers who watched the busy harbours. While the interior of the country resembled an open-air graveyard, the coastal ports were bustling hubs of commerce. Cranes loaded heavy crates of bacon and lard onto sturdy merchant vessels. Dock workers tallied barrels of salted pork under the watchful eyes of the constabulary. Modern research supports this grim assessment. Dr. Christine Keneally's extensive analysis of ship logs and customs data shattered the old apologetic myths. By digging through the dusty ledgers of the British customs offices, she traced the exact roots of this food. While the total exported harvest could not have fully replaced the potato's calories, the extraction was relentless. The supply chains were highly optimized. The food moved from the lush estates of the interior along heavily guarded toll roads straight through the very epicenters of starvation in the west and south. Now, the government in London did authorize some minimal relief measures. They approved the purchase of Indian corn from the United States to supply local soup kitchens. While the physical volume of this imported cheap maize exceeded continuing grain exports from 1847 onwards, it could not replace the massive caloric void of the potato. The export of beef, salted pork, bacon, and lard never paused for a single day. In fact, cattle exports actually increased compared to the years before the Blight. Some modern economists point out that the landlords themselves were trapped in a web of debt. They owed massive sums to London banks and were forced to liquidate the harvests to meet their financial obligations. But this defense only highlights the terrifying nature of the underlying structure.
Historically, during times of severe crisis, European governments would temporarily ban the export of food to stabilize local regions. The British government deliberately abandoned this tradition. Some politicians in London fiercely debated whether to close the Irish ports. But a new ideological purity had taken hold in the halls of power. Interfering with the market was viewed as a heresy. They chose to treat the situation as a vast economic experiment in laissez-faire policy. The market was allowed to correct itself, regardless of the human cost. The system continued to function exactly as designed, prioritizing property rights over local survival. The wheat, the oats, and the livestock were the legal property of the estate. The tenant farmer was merely a temporary instrument used to extract it from the soil. Millions of people were strictly locked into eating a single, highly specific clone known as the Irish lumper. By all contemporary accounts, the lumper was terrible. Historical sources from the era described it as a vile, watery bulb. It severely lacked flavor. It was heavy, unpleasant to digest, and held virtually no shelf life. You could not store it as a reliable commodity for the winter, nor could you trade it over long distances. Yet millions of people planted it anyway. The lumper possessed one critical biological advantage that outweighed all its flaws. It thrived on poor, wet soils. Why else would millions of people willingly plant a crop that thrived only in the poorest, wettest soils? This singular trait made it a highly efficient financial tool. The British land tenure system in Ireland relied heavily on absentee landlords. A massive portion of the country belonged to an Anglo-Protestant elite who rarely, if ever, set foot on the island. They lived comfortably in London. They viewed their vast, distant estates strictly as ledgers of steady revenue, completely disconnected from the people who actually worked the mud.
Management of these lands was delegated to local agents and ruthless middlemen. These managers utilized a practice known as subletting to maximize rent extraction. They carved the land into smaller and smaller pieces. By the time you reached the absolute bottom of this chain, a peasant family was left renting a microscopic sliver of barren, rocky ground, usually less than an acre in size. The good earth was completely locked up. The fertile, well-drained fields were strictly dedicated to cash crops. The high-quality wheat, the barley, and the pasture land for beef were all destined for the export docks to pay the absentee owners. The lumper became the literal currency of survival. An adult male laborer was consuming upwards of 10 to 14 pounds of this watery potato every single day just to maintain his caloric baseline. It allowed a family to stay alive while handing over everything of actual market value to the estate manager.
The potato resembles a mechanical specification rather than a diet.
The tuber functioned entirely as a biological wage. The human body consumed the flesh simply to generate the physical labor required to harvest the landlord's grain. The tenant's life acted as a physical insurance policy for the estate's profits. As long as the lumper grew, the rent was paid. You did not have to pay your agricultural workers in coin. You did not even have to provide them with high-quality food. You leased them the absolute worst fraction of your property, and they fed themselves with a root that biologically preferred awful conditions. The profit margins on the export crops were therefore staggering. cultivating this specific crop became a definitive marker of extreme poverty. Larger farms diversified their holdings. They planted grains or much higher quality potato varieties that could be sold in town markets. The lowest tier of society, however, was forced into absolute dependence on this single genetic strain. The land was chopped into smaller and smaller parcels, yet the lumper still provided just enough crude energy to keep the rent system moving. Some popular historical rumours suggest that British authorities quietly welcomed this exact dependency. A population subsisting entirely on cheap, easily grown tubers maximised the volume of exported grain without risking immediate starvation and rebellion. The poorer the soil required to feed the workforce, the more prime land could be monetised for the crown. Today, you can find niche gardening communities on social media swapping heritage seeds to keep this very old variety alive. Modern growers consistently note that its taste is truly mediocre. Eating one today feels almost like a ritualistic act of consuming the history of rent itself. While the lumper is grown as a novelty today, it originally served as a strict mechanism of economic control. Some agricultural historians claim the lumper was naturally vulnerable to disease by its very biological design. Others argue the issue was purely structural. The sheer lack of genetic diversity practically guaranteed a catastrophe. When the water mold Phytophthora infestans finally arrived, the breakdown was absolute. The disease swept through the dense, uniform plots with terrifying speed. Tubers just rotted in the fields. They turned into a black, foul-smelling slime before anyone could even dig them up. The blight hit all of Europe. From the fields of Belgium to the borders of Prussia, crops failed. But only Ireland experienced mass death. The crop failure instantly bankrupted millions of micro-tenants, acting as a massive, sudden financial default. The unwritten contract that kept them on the land evaporated in a matter of weeks.
The pig, the oats, the meager savings, everything was immediately seized by the agents to cover the missing rent. The cruelest paradox lay right outside the cabin door. A farmer, standing in a ruined potato patch, could physically see fields of healthy golden wheat waving in the wind. He had planted it. He had tended to it with his own hands. He could not touch it. Consuming a single sheaf of the export harvest to save his starving children constituted theft. It meant missing the rent payment entirely. Throughout the darkest years of the catastrophe, while families died in ditches with mouths stained green from eating grass, the export of food from Irish ports never paused for a single day. The commercial contracts were honoured to the letter. The agricultural commodities continued to flow toward the imperial centre under the strict guard of armed British dragoons. The penalty for default offered no escape. The military and the police would enforce immediate eviction. A family stripped of their lease was thrown out to freeze in the winter mud. The financial obligations to the London banks remained intact, while the human machinery was simply left to expire. Across the Irish Sea, the men controlling the fate of these evicted millions sat in comfortable offices in Whitehall. The British Treasury took undivided, centralised control over the crisis. They stripped local authorities of their power to intervene. Charles Edward Trevelyan, the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, stepped in as the chief coordinator of the state's response. He looked at the collapsing agricultural system and saw a necessary correction. Trevelyan did not view the blight as a catastrophic emergency requiring an unconditional rescue operation. In his written assessments, he explicitly described the failure of the potato as a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence. He believed God had intervened to cure a lazy, ungrateful, and rebellious country.
The Irish peasantry had grown too comfortable relying on a single route, and the heavens had stepped in to enforce discipline. This severe theology merged perfectly with the prevailing economic dogma of the era. The doctrine of laissez-faire dictated that government intervention would only prolong the agony of a failing system. The market had to find its own equilibrium. To Whitehall, the potato failure functioned exactly like a localized corporate bankruptcy. You do not flood a bankrupt subsidiary with free capital. You let it liquidate. The previous administration, under Prime Minister Robert Peel, had attempted a covert intervention. Peel had quietly purchased shipments of American maize to stabilize local prices and prevent immediate starvation. Trevelyan shut those state-run corn depots down the moment he gained sufficient influence. He argued that continuing to sell subsidized grain would distort private enterprise. The government had to step aside completely. Independent merchants must handle the food supply. If the state handed out free rations, Treasury officials warned, it would crash the price of bread in England. Would handing out free rations crash the price of bread in England and ruin honest traders? Protecting the profit margins of grain merchants became a significantly higher priority than securing calories for the starving. At the same time, the highly controversial corn laws heavily taxed any imported grain to protect domestic British agriculture. The British government faced a stark choice between saving human lives and maintaining their economic principles. They chose the principles. Yet, the administration could not simply ignore the masses of desperate people gathering on the roadsides. To prevent armed rebellion, they introduced a sprawling system of public works. The concept relied on a strict, punitive condition. Relief would never be given freely to anyone capable of walking. It had to be earned through intense physical labor, ensuring the poor did not become permanently dependent on the imperial treasury. This policy birthed a macabre biological paradox. Men and women suffering from severe malnutrition were handed heavy sledgehammers and iron shovels. They were marched out into the freezing winter rain to break rocks. They built roads. Most of these routes were intentionally designed to have no commercial value whatsoever, winding through barren bogs and connecting nothing. Local populations bitterly called them roads to nowhere. The government explicitly mandated that these public works could not compete with private enterprise or benefit local landowners. A starving farmer would drain his final remaining reserves of physical energy, hauling wet stones up a hill. In return, he received a few pennies a day. Those pennies were mathematically irrelevant. The meager wages fell far below the hyperinflated price of whatever grain remained in the local markets. Some local administrators in Ireland pleaded with London for a change in strategy. Their surviving correspondence reveals a deep frustration with the rigid instructions. They were forced to implement ideological goals while the catastrophe visibly worsened in their districts. The Treasury remained immovable. When the workers inevitably collapsed from exhaustion on the useless roads, the system offered one final destination. The only remaining destination was the workhouse system. These austere state institutions were originally designed to be as unappealing as possible. They remained a punitive last resort for those left with nothing, tearing families apart upon entry. Originally designed as a punitive last resort for the destitute, these austere state institutions tore families apart upon entry. Hundreds of thousands of severely weakened people crowded into these poorly ventilated stone buildings. The extreme overcrowding created the perfect environment for an epidemiological disaster. Famine fever swept rapidly through the wards. This blanket term covered explosive outbreaks of typhus and relapsing fever. The pathogens transmitted effortlessly through the dense clusters of unwashed, exhausted bodies. Entering a state-funded workhouse became a highly efficient method of contracting a fatal infection. The sheer volume of the sick overwhelmed the minimal medical staff, resulting in extremely high mortality rates within the facilities. Every shilling allocated for relief was heavily scrutinized against the rules of free trade. The sheer scale of the death toll eventually forced a reluctant pivot. Private charities, particularly the Quakers, along with the British Relief Association, began funding massive networks of free soup kitchens. The government begrudgingly integrated this model to keep the remaining population alive. They shifted away from demanding useless physical labor to simply handing out bowls of hot broth to anyone who asked. Trevelyan, however, maintained his core philosophy untouched. He personally toured the hardest-hit regions in October 1847. Despite witnessing the devastation firsthand, he returned to London and insisted on continuing a policy of severe financial austerity. He later authored an official defense of the government's actions titled The Irish Crisis. In this text, he justified the limited state intervention by stressing the critical need for shielding British finances from the pit of Irish poverty. He argued that the crisis allowed the natural forces of morality and commerce to finally reshape the island. Irish nationalist John Mitchell would later summarize the era with a bitter, enduring indictment. He labeled the government's response as deliberate murder, accusing London of weaponizing the Blight to empty the land of its people. The accounting books in London eventually balanced perfectly. The biological cost was entirely absorbed by the island across the water. By the early 1850s, the demographic ledger of the empire looked entirely different. Ireland had permanently lost roughly 20% of its population. Between 2 and 2.5 million people simply vanished from the official census, swallowed by mass graves or scattered across the ocean. The biological trigger for this massive shift was microscopically small. Recent international DNA analysis of museum potato specimens, published in the journal eLife, revealed that the pathogen responsible was a unique strain known as HERB1. Originating in the South American Andes, it likely traveled across the Atlantic via expanding trade routes. It was a previously unknown variant that European crops lacked any defense against. But the pathogen only killed the plant. The economic system killed the people. For the poorest tenant farmers, the final economic transaction they would ever make was a one-way ticket outward. They boarded retrofitted timber vessels originally designed to carry Canadian lumber eastward to Europe. The ship owners quickly realized that packing the empty return hulls with desperate humans was a highly lucrative secondary business. These dark, damp freighters earned a grim moniker almost immediately. People called them coffin ships. Buying a passage on one of these vessels was a voluntary leap into the abyss. Passengers were crammed into the unventilated holds, forced to endure weeks in darkness, breathing stagnant air, heavily infected with typhus and dysentery. On the most harrowing Atlantic crossings, up to 30% of the men, women, and children perished before the ship ever reached the quarantine stations of North America.
The bodies were unceremoniously dropped into the freezing water. The island they left behind was physically gutted. Before the first black spots of the HERB1 blight appeared on the leaves, the Irish population hovered around a robust 8.2 million. By the time the crisis officially receded in 1851, that number had plummeted to roughly 6.5 million. The year 1847, forever remembered as Black 47, marked the rock bottom of the collapse. Entire villages stood empty, their thatch roofs caving in under the heavy rain. The rural landscape fell completely, unnervingly silent. It was a demographic disaster so absolute that the nation would not recover its pre-famine numbers even into the 21st century. Roughly 1.5 million survivors poured into the urban centers of the United States and Canada.
They arrived destitute, forming a massive, sudden diaspora in the slums of the American eastern seaboard.
This forced exodus fundamentally shifted the ethnic and political balance of the entire Atlantic world. It seeded a deep, generational resentment toward the British colonial system, a highly organized anger that would eventually help fund and arm the Irish independence movement decades later. Back across the ocean, the absentee landlords surveyed their newly quiet fields. The crisis had effectively accomplished what years of complex colonial legislation could not. The fragile, precarious system of micro-tenancies was completely wiped out. The poorest laborers were either dead or gone, taking their total reliance on a single, vulnerable root vegetable with them. Was there any longer a pressing need to sustain a massive, barely surviving workforce on tiny patches of rocky soil? With the flesh and bone permanently cleared away, the land was aggressively consolidated.
The tiny plots were merged
into vast, highly profitable pastures for grazing sheep and cattle. The colonial administration had long viewed the traditional Irish agrarian society as hopelessly backward and dangerously overcrowded. It was reshaped to perfectly fit the capitalist demands of the metropolis, designed to provide high-quality beef and wool for the growing English middle class. Some contemporary officials even viewed the mass departure as a long-term economic blessing. They argued in official dispatches that the mass emigration finally relieved unbearable pressure on the domestic labor market. The destruction of the traditional rural economy allowed for a much cleaner, more streamlined system of agricultural production. The island finally became a colony in every sense, entirely focused on generating export revenue rather than feeding local mouths. The Laissez-Faire doctrine did not fail the empire. It delivered exactly what it promised.